Hello and welcome to Gardening at 58 North. So in this video I'd like to show you how you can resurrect your summer bedding plants if they're starting to look a bit bedraggled and they're starting to go over towards the middle and end of summer. So this is something that happens quite often with summer bedding plants. Most summer bedding plants are annuals, and what they'll want to do is they want to go to flower, set their seeds and then die off, just let the seeds carry on for the next generation. But if you keep taking off the dead heads and the old seeds, what you can do is you can prolong the flowering. But once they get to this stage, you need to do something a bit more drastic. So I've got 3 different plants here, and there's a couple of different methods you can use. I'll zoom in on the viola now and show you one of the methods, which is a little bit more time consuming, but the advantage of it is you get to keep more of the plant, you don't have to cut back as much, so it's a little bit less risky. So this method is better for trailing plants or for shrubby plants, plants where you want to keep most of the structure, such as trailing petunias or maybe a fuchsia. And what you want to do is look through the plant. There'll be lots of dead heads like this here. Basically, once the flower goes over, it tries to set seed. You want to remove all those seed heads, so instead of the energy going to the seed, the energy then goes into new growth, and it'll keep going for the rest of the summer with new flowers. But what I'm going to show you is a slightly different technique. So the technique I'm doing here is quite drastic, but it's best for plants which are really gone over like this one here. So these 2 plants on the side are alyssum plants, and they quite often flower early in the spring. They don't normally keep flowering all summer long unless you do deadhead them. So what I'm going to do now is cut them back quite severely. What that will do is encourage a lot more growth to come back. And it's quite easy to do on some plants. Other plants it's more difficult to see where to cut them. So on the alyssum it's hard to see where to cut. But on the Nemesia here, for example, it's easier to see where to cut. And one of the ways to tell it's ready for being cut back is what will be happening is you'll get less and less leaves, and the flowers will just start to peter out, and the whole plant might start to go a bit of a yellow colour. This Nemesia was going yellow colour earlier. You can see some of the lower leaves down there are quite a yellowy colour. This normally should have nice dark green leaves. So this one probably should be cut back in a couple of weeks. You could leave it a bit longer, but you can see there's quite long sections underneath the flower spikes at the top there, where there's lots of seeds developing. So there's going to be a lot of energy going into that seed development and not into new growth. So I'm going to cut this one back. I'll use this one as an example because it's quite easy to see where you need to cut back the plant. So with cutting this back, basically you want to cut it back so that you're cutting off all the flowering stems from this year. So you can see from this Nemesia, for example, what tends to happen with this plant is it has lots of leaves towards the base, and then higher up it has these long stems without any new leaves. What you want to do is cut off all these stems because they're just putting the energy into the seeds, and these stems don't have any leaves on them, so they can't provide any more energy for the plant to grow. It's the leaves where the plant harvests all the energy from the sunshine. So you want to cut them off just there. Now, if you have the time, the best way to do it would be to carefully cut it off at the point like that, just where there's 2 leaves appearing, and then you get 2 new shoots coming up. This method works well for most plants, but you'll need to know which kind of plant it is. Not all plants resprout from between the leaves, but the vast majority do. So you can just go around there doing that. You get a nice neat looking plant. You can cut off any straggly bits, and you know you're going to be cutting in exactly the right place, and so you don't have any kind of messy stems left over, and also you're not taking off any leaves that you need to. But to be honest, this method is very slow, time consuming. I only do this on plants that are really precious plants to me. The other way, which is much quicker and to be honest gets you similar results, is just to do a quick chop over the top of the plant, removing the majority of the top growth. So I'm just going to use a pair of scissors. I'm just going to snip all off the top. To say this plant isn't quite ready at this stage, I would have left it a couple more weeks, but I'm just using this as a demonstration. If I did leave this probably about another month, it would look a similar state as this alyssum here and be looking really quite sickly. So it's easy as just getting a pair of scissors, or maybe a hedge cutter if it's a larger plant. Just cut off all that old growth. Now it depends how leggy your plant is. You might want to cut a bit lower than just into the leaves. So if you're losing a bit of the shape of the plant, you can cut a bit further down. Always try and leave as many leaves as possible though. If you take too many leaves off, depending on the variety of plant, it can take a while to come back, because the leaves that give it the energy that it needs. So that's that one all cut back. I'll also do the same now with the alyssum and also the violas. So looking closely at the alyssum here, you can see there's very few leaves left. That's because all the energy from the plant was just going into the seeds. it's lost most of its leaves. Any nutrients that was in the leaves is probably sacrificed for seed production. And you can see the really yellow colour here of the violas. That's because, again, there's not much nutrients left. All the nutrients has been pulled out of the leaves to put into the seeds. So what happens is, as the summer goes on, the plant's going to be using up lots of nutrients from the soil or the compost, wherever it's growing in. And then towards the middle of summer, the end of summer, all that nutrients is going to be used up. The plant just doesn't have any nutrients to put into growth anymore, and it's just going to slowly peter out and die. So what you need to do now is make sure it's well fed. Now, normally when it comes to feeding bedding plants, you would give it a high potassium feed. The reason for that is you want lots of flowers. You don't want many leaves, because the leaves will just block out the flowers. But when you got it this stressed, you need to give it a general feed, or possibly even a high nitrogen feed if it's really looking quite sickly. But I would go for a general feed. If you go for a high nitrogen one, you are at risk of getting a bit too many leaves. So if you were to give it a normal high potassium feed, such as tomato feed, these you would put on some new growth. They would do a little bit better for it, but they probably go straight to flower, and they wouldn't grow many leaves, and they probably just die out after the first flush of flowers, and they just have a small flowering display. But if you give it a general feed, what will happen is it will flower a little bit later on, and it will put on a nice covering of leaves, and then shortly after those leaves have greened up nicely, it will then start flowering again, and it should flower just about as well as it did at the beginning of the year. So make sure it's a general feed. Follow the instructions on the packet. I would go for a liquid feed. That way it gets into the compost straight away. At this time of year, it's not much point using a granular feed. That's more for long-term feeding over the whole season. You want an instant effect, so go for a liquid feed. As I say, go for a well-balanced general feed, which should have equal amounts of nitrogen, potassium and phosphorus. And that can be seen on the side of the packet when you're looking for the fertilizers. So what I'm going to do now is give these a feed, put them in a nice sunny location. I'll come back to you at the end of the video and we'll see the results and see how well they responded to the treatments. So it's now 3 weeks later, and as you can see, the plants are recovered quite nicely. You could probably see from the time lapse previously, this one started to regrow quite quickly. And the reason for that is it was already not in too bad a shape, so it responded much faster. If your plants are already in a good shape when you cut them back, they're going to respond a lot quicker and come into bloom quite fast. So you can see this one, for example. The foliage is now nice and dark green. You can see underneath some of the older foliage, which is a kind of a paler yellow green. But the newer foliage on the top is a nice dark green. What this did is it put on a quick flush of leaves, but then straight away started to flower. So this one, because it's quite healthy looking now, I can probably switch to a tomato feed, something high in potassium. When it's really struggling and it's touch and go, give it the balanced feed. But then once it's got plenty of leaves and it's growing nicely, then you can go onto a tomato feed, and that will encourage lots of nice flowering. If you continue too much with the general feed with the high nitrogen levels, what can happen is you can get lots of leaves and you don't get many flowers. So once you've got a good number of leaves, go ahead with the tomato feed. And I can show you this one here as well, which has recovered nicely, but not quite as well. So as you can see, the viola here has put on lots of new shoots, and it's even got some flowers as well. So this is going to come into flower just within a few weeks' time. This viola will actually be covered in flowers. You can see there's lots of little shoots coming up here. Lots of little flower buds starting to appear, so that will be covered in flowers. The Allison was really quite poorly, and so that's taken a bit longer to recover. So you can see the Allison there does have quite a lot of new leaves. When I showed you previously, there was almost not a single leaf left on it, completely died back. Some of the new leaves are damaged. That's because I have got some insects eating it at the moment, but this new growth should come through nice and fresh and undamaged unless you've got insects like I do. And this one is a little bit further away from flowering. So I'll probably, I'll let it leaf up a little bit more. You can still see through some of the branches, so it's not completely leafed up. I'll leave it a few more weeks, then I'll switch to a tomato feed if it's not flowering by then. But I suspect this will be flowering in the next 2 or 3 weeks. There is 1 or 2 just starting to show flower buds, and I'll zoom into one now just to give you an example. So this one here is one that's just starting to flower. It's kind of hard to show, but just in the middle of the leaves there's some kind of rounded shoots. They're the first flower buds just starting to come. So that'll be flowering in about a week or two's time. The rest of the plant, as I say, doesn't have flower buds yet, but should be flowering soon. So that's all for this video. It's just to give you guys an idea of what you can do to restore your summer bedding plants if they look like they're going over or if they're dying. Just give them a good hard cut back, give them the feed high in nitrogen or a good balanced feed, and you should get some good results within 2 or 3 weeks. If it's the end of summer, it might take a bit longer. If it's still warm and you've got good growing conditions, sometimes it can take as little as a week or two for the flowers to come through, such as this nemesia here. This probably only took about 1 week to start flowering again, whereas other plants which are a bit further gone, they might take up to a month.